Thanks for being here. Some of you I know very well. Some of you are fresh faces, so thank you for coming. If you were here during my last presentation on the power threat meaning framework, that was a lot, sort of academically speaking. I promise it won't be that intense this time. I'm pretty sure I gave everyone like a 35-page handout, so I won't scare you with that again. I do have some handouts, but we're gonna wait to pass those out. Tonight we're talking about guilt and shame, which is not a fun topic in of itself, but I would like to find a way to make it a not so scary topic. I feel like it's one that's still really important to talk about with those who've left cults and coercive groups because of how it can interfere with the recovery process. So I'm gonna just sort of start with some icebreaker questions to the group. Kent's gonna make a presentation on guilt and shame, and then I will finish with possible approaches to recovery from coercive control. So that's the direction we're gonna head tonight. So in order to make this topic a little less scary, I just kind of wanted to start with a group exercise. I won't split you up into small groups or anything horrible, I promise. But I wanted to start with just 3 questions. And I'd love to hear from anyone, because even though we've left different groups, movements, our experiences are typically very similar. We find a lot of that. So my first question is, what do you think the differences are between the terms guilt and shame? If any, is this something that you guys have maybe thought about, considered? There's no wrong answers. What comes to mind, when you think about the differences between guilt and shame?
First thing that comes to my mind is guilt is something I feel, shame is something somebody puts on me. But I don't know, that's really true.
I love that. Yeah, that's great. Anything else? Yeah?
I think of it as guilt is that awareness of what may or may not be a wrongdoing on your part. You're guilty. It's just a simple awareness of doing something wrong or whatever. Shame is the assessment that you go on to make where you determine that you're not really a worthy human being because of what you did or what you experienced. So
Or that internalized.
yeah, it's an internalized judgment on you because you're guilty, therefore you don't deserve the air you breathe, pretty much,
Right.
kind of something like that.
Right. That's great. Any other observations? Yeah.
Maybe similar to that, guilt is tied with actions, shame with identity. And I think guilt can be productive and push you to maybe become aware of something you've done and remedy it. And shame, I don't think, is ever a productive experience.
That's really good.
The way you frame that's really interesting. Like the question of, can guilt be positive? That's not normally something that we consider. So I really liked.
It can be.
It can be, not always, of course, but I really like how you broke that down between identity, especially. Any other observations on that before we move to the next question? I just kind of wanted us to get in the mindset of guilt and shame as a topic and what these two things mean. The next question I have is, what are some examples of ways that groups induce feelings of guilt and shame? These can be really broad. They don't have to necessarily be personal. For one, within high control Christian groups, the fear of hell is something that comes to mind. Fire and brimstone churches, a lot of control in that sense. Any other experiences beyond that? Yeah.
That you're letting the group down or someone else will have to do your work.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't do whatever.
Yeah, I love that. Like it's on your shoulders to kind of carry. Yeah, totally. Or maybe you're letting your family down. If your family's in the group and you leave, you're letting your family down.
There's some theological and doctrinal constructs that can be legitimate enough of themselves to believe or not believe, but then they're used in ways that really hurt the group.
Right.
Like my belief is that there is something broken in people, in all people. But I don't believe all people are therefore worthy of shame and castigation or something. It's just that's a reality we all carry. But some ministries go on, I'm a pastor, some ministries go on and really use that to keep anybody from feeling healed or worthy or joyful or anything. That just, they never help them get relief from that fact or find an answer.
Thank you for sharing that. Even beyond Christian settings, I'm thinking of like, maybe perhaps New Age groups. I mean, there's people who I know, who I'm very close to, where they believe that you had to meditate in order to save the world. So if you're not meditating as often as the group wants you to save the world, then that could be a failure, not just to yourself, but to the greater context of society. And that's a pretty wild burden to carry. I can only imagine. Anything else before we move to the last question? Yeah.
I'm thinking back to the group that we were in and how they did this. Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah. What are some examples of ways that groups can induce these feelings?
Well, it seems like our group just kind of a lot of sarcastic mocking.
Oh,
Yeah, playground stuff. It was kind of silly.
so kind of bullying behavior.
Yeah. Kind of rolling your eyes anyway, but also another thing though that was more serious, I think, was drawing people out, creating an atmosphere that seemed safe so that you felt like you could bare your soul.
Okay.
And encouraging people to feel free to just say it all, tell it all,
Yeah.
get it out.
Yeah.
Get your guilt off your back and share it, and then
Right.
I don't know, then they would use that against you.
What you bring up is a concept, I think it's really important. So what Sharon was talking about has a lot to do with attachment and attachment theory. And healthy attachment allows you and the person who you're in relationship with, it allows this sort of fresh opening up outside of just that relationship. For example, you can turn to other people and that's okay. It's sort of this open thing. That's a healthy relationship. An unhealthy relationship is when you can only go to that person for advice. That person becomes very controlling. That can be a very unhealthy relationship, where they prevent you from going outside of the relationship to seek help, guidance, and whatever. But what Sharon's talking about and what groups are really good at doing is this sort of, what you're describing is trauma bonding in a lot of ways. That's sort of trauma-induced attachment. So what that means is the perpetrator establishes a very safe relationship with someone like you or someone else in the group, and you feel trusted. You feel like you can bare sort of your soul, that information to them. And because you initially have that trust, you're more likely to share. You think, oh, this is a healthy, open relationship. But then what they then do is take that information and use it against you. And the problem that that creates is psychologically, is you keep going to them, not only because at first you thought maybe they were a safe space, but because they've created themselves as the only option, the only person you can go to and ask for help or advice. So that is, the groups often form these sort of trauma course attachments with members, and I think that's really important to mention when talking about guilt and shame, because at the root of a lot of that is relationships. And then my final question, if no one has anything else on that, how can guilt and shame experienced in a coercive environment impact you post-cult? So how can these feelings of guilt and shame that you've carried and experienced in a cult affect you since leaving? I know for me, relationships can be huge. I know Brian and I experience this all the time, relationships with family, post-cult. We're constantly been, like our parents like to make us feel guilty for things all the time.
Just this morning.
Yeah, just this morning. Just this morning. Yeah, and some of that may be like more playful. Other times it's more spiritually abusive. So relationships is huge. How else could this affect the recovery process? Yeah.
I was thinking while you were speaking of that, like I've had experiences of people saying that it's because I have shame that I've left, and that because I'm ashamed of myself doing things that are outside of the group's prescriptions, that that's why I'm no longer there. So it's like this whole twisted
Yeah.
backlash. And also just like just the heaviness of knowing that people are speaking badly of you, and
Yeah.
people that you love, people that are in your family,
Yeah.
because that's a way that they were already causing guilt and shame. Yeah, it definitely makes it hard to be in relationships and trust people.
Yeah. Yeah, so when it comes to future relationships, even wanting to put trust, like how do you know who to trust after experiencing such a lack of trust? And some people can't even be in contact with their families because of the induced guilt and shame and that sort of level of intensity. Thank you. Did someone have something else over here? Did you have something?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a straight up trigger that you relive it. It could be something that's really similar.
Yeah.
And that feeling that guilt and shame washes over you. And for me, it's a lot of second guessing. Coulda, woulda,
Not being
shoulda.
able to trust yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are, the reason I kind of wanted to start with this is already we share so many diverse experiences in this room, but we're finding this common ground. And, you know, with the comment you said, and even what Todd said and Sharon said, everyone's sitting there like, oh yeah, like we're all experiencing this, and we have in different ways. So, did you have something?
No, I'm just
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, that's kind of my icebreakers. Obviously, why we even want to discuss this topic is because these are some of the concepts that we feel like are worth exploring, because if we don't explore these topics, I feel like learning more about them can hopefully help make the recovery process easier, you know, kind of delving into these things and having a safe space to do that. So at this time, I want to turn it over to Kent, and then at the end, I'm going to talk about psychological approaches to coercive control recovery from. Yeah.
Very good. And I think we've jumped into this very neatly. A lot of things that you said are things that I wanted to make a point of, and you brought them out very well. I had a young man who was in the Unification Church, was recruited, and he was a tennis pro. Was a really smart young man and very good looking. Was used to a lot of affection, people kind of looking at him adoringly. He was one of those guys that if you walk in the room, every female eye gets turned, maybe every gay guy eye, you know. He was taken by a young woman who worked really hard to get him to come to the weekend workshop. And the weekend workshop turned into 3 weeks, and 3 weeks turned into 6 months, and 6 months turned into 3 years. And he left on his own. And to tell you what happened, in the group there was so much guilt laid on people's heads that they would respond. I mean, it's like a never-ending loop, huh? If I can make you feel guilty, I can make you come back to me to get unguilty, and I make you unguilty to then reinstate the guilt in another way to keep it going so that you never stop. So he got out of this loop because they were all being so nice and friendly to him, but the guilt was too much, and he left because he felt unworthy to stay.
Wow.
So after 3 or 4 months, he's feeling better about himself. He goes back to teaching tennis. Life is good. He says, now maybe I'm worthy of trying again. And he goes back. And the same cycle happened again. You know, he was immune to all the love bombing because he was so used to that in his normal life anyway. So he left for the 3rd time. Now the 3rd time he left, he got invited to a dinner where there happened to be 2 ex-Moonies and myself as part of the dinner guests. He didn't know that. We knew that, but anyway, we sat him down after dinner and started talking, and our talking went for probably about 3.5 hours. And we talked about all the things that he did and didn't do. One of the things that he later told me a couple of years later, was he felt really guilty about walking up to people with flowers and saying, hey, we're selling this for our church, implying that their church was his church, that his church was their church. And that he, I asked him, what did you think that lady thought when you were holding out the flowers? What did you think was in her head? And he thought for a minute, and just was quiet. He told me a year and a half later, he felt for the first time his brain started to turn, had started to move, because he was thinking about, my gosh, I told a lie. And he was feeling really guilty about that. But the thing about the lies that you tell in a cult is that this is what's induced in you. It's part of the culture, and it's not something that you're really responsible for. And that's one of the things I'll hit in just a little bit. But I wanted to kind of clarify, when I'm talking about guilt, I really mean things that we feel when we feel like we've wronged somebody. Now, shame goes to, and I think Ken gave a good sense of that. It goes to your being. It goes to who you are, that you're not worthy to be around. And guilt and shame are both feelings, and feelings are subject to manipulation by nice groups. And thoughts and feelings are pretty much what the manipulators want to go after. For example, a leader may berate you for harshly being a minute late for a meeting. You may feel guilty about that transgression, but if the leader then rails on and accuses you of being selfish, being a narcissist, a person who doesn't think of others, then he's adding a sense of shame on top of the guilt. And you go from, I am a bad person, I did something bad, to I am a bad person. So guilt and shame kind of work, and there's sort of one hand washes the other with that thing. When you leave your group, you may continue to experience intense feelings of guilt when the group's thoughts and feelings are brought up to you or surface. You were talking about having an experience where something was parallel and brought back a flood of guilt and shame. And the guilt is something that you really have to work out because it will arise spontaneously. But the thing to do with the guilt is to stop and say, I'm feeling guilty. Who's benefiting from my feeling guilty? Who's coming up on the top from my feeling guilty? And chances are it's going to come back to the group, or something the group wanted you to do or felt you ought to do, or how you should have dealt with your parents, or how you should have dealt with the outside world in some way. So that guilt is a sure sign of the group's manipulation. Does feeling guilty about it serve the group's interest in controlling you? In fact, when one feels or thinks those things, is there any evil at all? And I think it's important to realize that having thoughts or feelings, whatever you feel guilty about, thoughts and feelings are not by themselves good or bad. They're morally neutral. I may have a sexual feeling. Well, that's fine. Groups love to stimulate sexual feelings and then make you feel really bad about them. But in fact, a sexual feeling isn't good or bad by itself. It all depends on how you respond to it. And you can respond to it in a virtuous way or a really wicked way. But that's true with all of our thoughts and feelings. You may have and in fact, things like doubt especially are targets of assault in the group. Doubt is probably one of the best feelings around because it's an opportunity for you to stop and think about what you really believe about something, what you really think is honest and true. And that's being virtuous. In fact, I have a case where a former member was told often that if she ever doubted the exalted role of the group's leader, she would lose her faith in God and become a fallen person. But she allowed the doubt she felt to give her a chance to rethink her belief in the leader and realize that she still believed in God, even though she didn't believe in the leader anymore. She later left the group, realizing that the doubt she once had led her to both God and to her personal freedom. So a feeling of doubt actually led her to someplace really neat. And yet, we're so trained in groups to experience doubt as a bad thing. Satan's attacking you, you're being worldly, or you probably can come up with a dozen more things than that. So it's important to distinguish between guilt that cults try to instill, and the guilt you may feel that really is yours in a certain sense. I'm saying this in a qualified sense, and I'll get back to why I say that. You may have lied to your parents or your family or your friends about the group or what you're doing in it. You may have solicited money for the group that wasn't actually going to the cause that you talked about. You may have just plain outright lied to people. You got to realize, though, that your own moral compass and the moral compass of the group were at odds. In other words, you were not bad, you were misled. And because of being misled, you said the things that followed from the inner workings of the group, rather than what was really your own. And I know a lot of families that have been reunited because the former cult member went back and just said, I'm really sorry. They went and made amends for the nasty things, the times that they hadn't been there for the family, or the things that they had said or done that were against the family. And how amazing the families turned around and are so welcoming and so happy to see that person back with their forgiveness usually is overwhelming. But the forgiveness that's really, really important is the ability to forgive yourself. And I think that's the most important part of dealing with guilt, is that you got to realize that a lot of the stuff comes from the group. You know, ask the question, does your guilt serve the group or does it serve you? And then forgive yourself for it. It's really okay, because you were misled. You weren't intrinsically bad. The point is that to the degree that you're under psychological duress, you are not responsible for those behaviors, and you are justified in forgiving yourself. Okay, does that make sense?
I want to add a qualifier.
Go ahead.
It's hard to not take responsibility, even if you were misled. You know, even doing things under the group's influence, like, that's so almost easier said than done.
Oh, I absolutely agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally.
What you mentioned about being reunited with family members after, you know, saying like, I'm just like, sorry, this, you know, there are people who, I just wanted to say, are born and raised in groups. Like for example, my family is still in a group. That may work for people who may not be born or raised. So just wanted to,
doesn't apply to SGA
Right.
type folks.
Right.
That's really true. And the difference between SGAs and MGAs I learned this past week was that second generation people still have relatives or people that are outside the group that they can connect with. Multi-generational people haven't got a soul that's outside the group. And you know, when you leave the group, then you've got to really rebuild your identity from ground zero. So then I want to say a few words about shame, because that's the result of a message saying that you're not good enough, that you're unworthy, that your being is bad. And the application of shame by the group leadership or system is literally an all-out assault against your sense of self-worth and your sense of well-being. And that's a lesson that they learn early on, is that to the degree they can diminish your sense of self, they make you more pliable, more easy to control. So then the result is to recognize that any residual shame you may feel as a result of this isn't warranted, because it's a fundamental assumption of our democracies and many philosophies and even some theologies, most good theologies in the Western world, that your being is essentially good, that who you are is really worthy and worthwhile. And I'll pick on a couple of things. It was the 4th of July when I was thinking about this, so I wrote down this from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, you've got to be a worthy being to enjoy those rights. So that's the assumption that's behind our Declaration of Independence. Now, I liked Aristotle, probably because I had to study Aristotle a lot. The most serious Aristotelian study I ever did was on St. Patrick's Day, when they were serving Irish coffee upstairs in the rec room, and I came downstairs to study Aristotle, and I was wide awake with the Irish coffee for hours. But Aristotle says the final end of human life, the kind of purpose of human life, is to flourish, to live well, to have a good life. All actions should aim toward this end. Of course, in order to live at all, we need food, clothing, and shelter. But living is itself the means to the end of living well. So again, from a purely secular Aristotelian perspective, your being is something that's inherently good and worthwhile. And not to leave philosophy undone, I went to Kierkegaard and looked at what an existentialist might have to say. Basically, Kierkegaard's essential quest is, what is the meaning of life? What does it mean? He says that everyone must come to their own answer, but his assertion is that life does have meaning and value, and our job is simply to discover what we believe to be that end of value for ourselves. And then, if you'll forgive me a little bit, I don't know how many were Bible-based groups or not, but I'm going to quote scripture at you. Forgive me. I was a Catholic priest for 20 years. It's an old habit. I'm sorry.
What version can King James?
Actually, the line that I want to quote is really easy. God creates in 6 days. God creates the world. He creates us. He creates the animals and the trees, the birds, and the Bushmere. And then in Genesis 1, verse 31, it says, "And God looked at everything that he had made and saw that it was very good." Well, that's pretty amazing, for the whole Judeo-Christian tradition is founded on that notion that what we are made in our being is very, very good to start with. And that applies to us. I mean, it applies to each one of us. We're supposed to take that in and let that be the truth about ourselves. From a healthy theological point of view. I mean, I'm sure there are poets that will turn that around upside down and backwards and
As
make it
someone
crazy.
who was born and raised in a really horrible Bible-based group, that it was always you're bad. Like the fundamental assumption was, you're bad,
Absolutely.
right out the gate kind of thing. So,
Yeah. And then there are other places you can hop to in the New Testament where Jesus is saying, how much more valuable are you than these sparrows, or that kind of thing, or the fact that Jesus would come and say, I'm going to offer my life for you because I think you're worth that much. I mean, that's from a Judeo-Christian perspective a pretty neat hit. So basically, if your group experience leads you to feel about yourself that you are unworthy of respect from others, that you're a loser, that you're damned, then you know that you've still been in that trap. And you really need to process those feelings and dig your way out of that stuff. There is a way out, and I'm going to hand this back to Ashlen now, and she's going to talk about more ways to do that. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you for talking about, I love that you hit on Aristotle and a philosophy perspective and theological perspective. So thank you for hitting on all those different perspectives.
You're most welcome.
And then you said a name in there who I didn't even recognize.
Oh, Kierkegaard? Sorry, Kierkegaard, an existentialist philosopher.
I don't even know how to say that.
Oh, okay.
I don't even know how to say that. So
Okay.
thank you for hitting on all of that.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to talk briefly, just for a few minutes, about, my background is in the psychology of coercive control. And so we study potential approaches to, recovery, psychological recovery after you've experienced coercive control. And certainly, we all could probably use some help recovery-wise when experiencing guilt and shame. Now, when I say recovery, this is something that is very personal to everybody. This is something that, I always encourage having a mental health professional, having a mental health therapist, someone who you can go to work on sort of creating a unique plan that's best for you in terms of a recovery approach. So what I'm going to be talking about is just a possible approach, a potential approach, but if it's not the best route for you, then that's totally fine. But I found it really interesting when looking back through in terms, doing research on coercive control, when we talked about self-criticism, guilt, and shame, I would love to hear from some of you, what is the antithesis? What is the opposite of, self-critical thinking, guilt, and shame? Like, what words come to mind that is completely opposite of that? And Ryan, you're not allowed to answer because you know the answer already. There's no wrong answers. Yeah. Any positive spins on that?
Healthy pride.
Ooh, healthy pride. I love that. Anything else? I'm sorry I like to put you guys on the spot. I just like to hear your answers.
I think that the embracing not only of expressing and giving love to those around you, but also receiving love from those around you. 'Cause
Okay.
that seems like the thing that kind of gets gummed up when you're
Yeah.
operating out of shame and guilt. You're not worthy of love, and you're not really equipped for genuine love because you don't love yourself, and I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well, you're actually onto something. Ken's onto something. And like I said, Brian already knows the answers because he's seen my handout. But I feel like compassion.
You've seen
You've seen my handout.
I was thinking maybe apathy, but
Oh.
like, I don't care that you think I should feel guilty or shame. Because I don't feel guilty or shame.
Well, that's the other existentialist Sartre. He was
Yeah.
getting down.
Yeah, there's a line of philosophy on
Yeah.
that too.
Well, that's certainly approach. That's an approach. We're going to talk about compassion though for a few minutes. Not apathy, but compassion. Although I liked your answer.
Is now the time for that handout, by the way?
Yeah, if you don't mind. You can pass out more handouts if you like. So there's actually, cognitive behavioral therapy. Within the world of CBT, there is an approach called compassion-focused therapy, and it's known as CFT. Now, if you don't have a therapist, someone who practices self-compassion therapy, there is also something known as compassion mind training, CMT, where you can sort of develop these skills introspectively on your own time. There's guidelines and things to help you do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about compassion-focused therapy. This was developed by Paul Gilbert, Dr. Paul Gilbert, and Gilbert's sort of motif was he designed this to help with low mood, high levels of shame, and self-criticism, which I feel like is very pertinent to this. I mean, how many CBT things do you hear of that is directly targeting high levels of shame? Gilbert's belief is that individuals can be helped to train their minds to improve well-being by learning to cope with emotional discomfort through cultivating compassion. And this sounds really dreamy, like, of course, we can cultivate more compassion in order to be able to cope more emotionally through emotional distress. But I know especially for cult survivors, self-compassion can be extremely difficult to cultivate after a cult. I mean, how many of us in this room have probably felt that the cult made you feel like it was all your fault? It was always all your fault. And so I feel like it's really important to mention self-compassion as a means to sort of counteract feelings of guilt and shame. So in the handout, you'll see a few different graphs and charts, but I wanted to kind of start with this question is, how does our brain process negative emotions such as guilt and shame? How does our brain sort of sort that out? And the answer lies within our there's three types of affect regulation systems. Does anyone know what an affect regulation system is, by chance? It's okay if not. It's just your brain's way of processing and dealing with emotions and being able to counteract with your everyday environment. Did you have something to add?
No, I'm just cheering you on.
Oh, cool. Okay, you're like making this little, I'm just seeing like, yeah. So being able to respond to everyday environments and stimuli in a healthy way. And there's three types of regulation systems. This was identified by Paul Gilbert. And the first one is incentive, resource focused. The second is non-wanting, affiliative focused. And the third is threat focused. And does anyone want to guess which system is the most dominant in most cases?
Gonna call it? Gonna call it?
Yeah,
Yeah, I go with threat.
the threat focus. Yeah, right. And that's actually actually true for the majority of people. In cults, outside of cults, the threat-based system is the one that's most dominant. And there's a good reason for that, is because we're on high alert and we've been mistreated by people in the group. And so you'll notice, you can read more about the systems here in this sort of chart here, about the different 3 effect regulatory systems. That's a whole deep dive in of itself, but I thought it was useful to kind of point out. So unfortunately, the threat system can have a huge impact on how we cope with everyday emotions, how we deal with, residual emotions such as guilt and shame. And this is a quote from Gilbert: "It is now recognized that the threat system is our dominant system and creates what is sometimes called the negativity bias. That is, we pay more attention to, process, and remember more easily negative than positive events." I don't know about you guys, but when I get down, I can sometimes stay down for a while, everything feels bad all the time, sort of. And that kind of just speaks to Gilbert's hypothesis. So I feel like understanding this and these different regulatory processes help assist recovery. So kind of coming back to, the aim of compassion-focused therapy, which is to balance the 3 systems by building soothing, affiliative, and safeness systems. So if we can find a way to balance these systems, and I know it's not perfect, and I know that, we're gonna have to find our own sort of unique paths to do that. But by balancing the systems, we will be able to easier respond to negative emotions and threats. And I wanted to mention Maslow's hierarchy of needs here. We talked about, and what I just sort of quoted, when it comes to environments where coercive control exists, and we don't have basic safety measures, in place, if we don't feel safe, if we're in an unhealthy environment, this very much so affects emotional regulation and processing. And so ensuring a safe environment is one of the first steps towards healthy regulation and allows a healthy foundation moving forward towards more self-compassion. I realize that may not be, that's kind of a no-duh statement, of course we need to feel safe, but I just wanted to emphasize that because sometimes people leave groups and they end up in unsafe situations all over again. Could be relationships, could be another group, could just be their current situation may not be stable, and it can affect emotional regulation. And so I hope you feel sort of validated if you do have problems with emotional regulation. There are very real reasons for that, and that doesn't mean that you're broken. It's purely environmental. If we don't have a safe place to process and understand recovery, we're not going to get very far. So being able to give oneself more self-compassion may even have positive resounding effects. In your handout, you'll notice the little arrows about the compassion cycle. I really like this chart from Jeanette Roddy, and it talks about how if you feel compassion for yourself, you can give compassion to another, and then receive compassion as well. Do you guys have that chart?
Yeah.
Ryan, you're on handout too, right?
Ryan.
We don't have. I blame UPS for this. It's probably in the other handout.
Okay, I'll sort out the handouts in a second for you guys. But I did draw this, but I knew Ryan would make fun of my handwriting, so I kind of waited unless necessary. Ta-da!
You did good this time.
Didn't I?
Yeah.
I thought it was better than last time.
Yeah. Much better.
So this is the compassion cycle. So by feeling compassion for myself, that can extend in all kinds of directions. I give compassion to another, and then from there, I receive compassion from another. So it really is this beautiful cycle. So feeling compassion for yourself extends beyond just you. You have the energy, you have the ability to sort of pay it forward in a lot of ways. And I know that, once again, for cult survivors, having self-compassion is easier said than done. And so there is a handout, and if you guys don't have it, I'll make sure you have it. there's bullet points on how to develop more compassionate attributes. And this comes into the compassionate mind training. It's sort of like a self version of CBT, so to speak. These are things that you can work on with a therapist. I highly recommend. If you don't have access to a therapist, or if you're interested in learning more, these are bullet points that you can go through on your own.
Sorry, C, remind me?
Sorry, so there's CBT, cognitive behavioral
Okay,
therapy.
gotcha, yes,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, so it's a form of CBT, this compassionate mind training. So there's a lot of bullet points there. I won't go through them all today on developing more compassionate attributes. Do you guys have that by chance in your handout? Okay, good. So that's something that you can look through on your own time. And I kind of wanted to end by just saying that, you know, you were so validated. If self-compassion is something that you really struggle with, please know that you're not alone. It's not impossible. We can retrain our brains to be in a more positive place, to accept and give more self-compassion and give more compassion to others. And the cults really stripped us of a safe space to where we could even do that and process how to do that. So leaving cults, something that I see the most of is just emotional regulation. And I understand that that can be a very hard thing to get back in check. So that can be an ongoing recovery process. So please know it's not your fault. It's the cult's fault. You know, you were really manipulated. And so I just wanted to end in your handouts, and if you don't have them, there is a take-home self-compassion quiz. And this was developed by Dr. Kristen Neff.
That one's still on the table.
It's on the table, okay.
You told me to not take that.
It's okay. It's time now. You can give it away.
Pick it up on the way.
You got it.
Because I
Okay.
was late.
That's okay. Thank you. The self-compassion quiz. Ryan's a hot mess over there. It's okay.
Emphasis on hot.
Yeah. The self-compassion quiz is really cool to see. It kind of just gives you a baseline, like how are you doing in terms of self-compassion. My score was really low. Full disclosure, this is something that I have a really hard time with. Still feeling like a lot of things are your fault. So that could yield some pretty interesting perspective. And something that you can even talk with your therapist about, you know, if you're working with a clinician. And you know, the research, Kristen's research on self-compassion is phenomenal, so I highly recommend. So I'll pass that out now to people, but thank you for being here. Is there anything else that you wanted to say on guilt and shame?
Compassion just opens up a whole,
Yeah.
I
I wanted to end on a positive thing.
I like the word compassion. The root is compasio. It literally means to suffer with. And you identify with somebody else's suffering because it comes out of your own. I mean, that's why I think former cult leaders are some of the most compassionate people I've ever met. But the suffering with also has to do with yourself. It has to start with acknowledging that in fact you do carry some suffering. That you do carry that pain. You do carry that locked down sense of your emotions. And it's really important to give yourself credit for what you've been through. And then compassion can flow out from that. So I think it's really important to just let it be okay that you suffer in the group. And not that it's okay to suffer in the group, but that it's okay that you experience that and you can translate that into something really wonderful.
I was remembering that I was challenged, I was a foster mom for some time, and I was challenged once to think about that child and the child's parent who was, you know, all of the children had horrible stories of neglect and abuse, just, you know, moms and dads that were just terrible. But the challenge was think about that parent and think ahead of time before the child asks you to make sense of it. And think compassionately about that parent. And then think how you're going to explain with compassion